Okay, we at least have half an hour for questions, and I am interested in questions to all of the panelists, and if you have other questions regarding the project, they're also more than welcome. Who would like to start us off here? Please, and if you could identify yourselves too.
Sure. Hello everyone, my name is Tracy. I'm a student in the Nonproliferation Terrorism Studies program. I also am a graduate research assistant at CNS here. I'd like to thank all of our presenters for their really compelling presentations, but my question is for Adlon actually. I was hoping that you could elaborate on two different really interesting events that you mentioned in your presentation. One would be the event where the US and Russia worked together to impose sanctions on Russian entities. Just hoping you could give a little more detail because I think that's really fascinating. And the second event, I was hoping you could elaborate on, I believe in 2003, 4, 5, in that area, when the EU3 began negotiations with Iran, but because of US pressure that didn't work out. I was hoping if you could, just for my own knowledge, clarify whether US was at some point involved and then backed away and took everyone with them, or if it was something that happened separately and the US interfered, or just sort of what the circumstances of that were.
Are we going one by one?
Why don't we start like that and we'll see how long it takes.
Okay. Well, the imposition of sanctions in 1998, if I'm not mistaken, it is all, I read that in actually Dr. Einhorn's and Gary Seymour's paper for Peer Center.
He's not a doctor, but a very distinguished former diplomat.
Yeah, but right now he, okay. And he wrote that US officials and Russian officials coordinated the imposition of sanctions on 7 entities which collaborated with Iran. They did not violate international law, but certainly they contradicted an informal US-Russian agreement on non-cooperation with Iran. And those were entities which worked in the sphere of missile program and in the sphere of peaceful use of nuclear energy. The Congress was ready to decrease the amount of money which was devoted and allocated for the CDR program, Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. And when US government testified, representatives testified in the US Congress, they said that there is no reason to do that. It will only harm our relations and it will have negative impact on US and Russian export control regime and all the issues. That's why they decided to impose the executive sanctions on Russian entities without involving Congress. And that actually helped a lot. And the years 2003 and 2005, US was not involved in negotiations at all, and when Iranians sent a memo with a proposal for having the negotiations, it is declassified, actually you can read it, through a Swiss embassy. The US rejected this plan, and they were even angry with the with the Swiss ambassador who sent it with his own cover letter, saying that I trust Iranians because they really want to have negotiations, and it is true. They said you should not do that. You're not supposed to write cover letters for the US administration. Well, I kind of was making things like, I don't know, brighter, but at the same time, that was the case. So it is evil, and we're not negotiating with evil at all. But after the trip of Igor Ivanov to Washington in 2 years, 3 years, the situation changed, but it was late. That's it.
Thank you, Adlon. Others who would like to? Okay, Jeff and then Paul.
So I have a comment or observation rather than a question, but you know, the Nikolai and Sarah, both of you very explicitly stated that, and I think correctly, that national interests are an important part of the explanation for cooperation. If the two countries happen to coincide, both seeing non-proliferation outcomes being in their national interest, they're more likely to cooperate. Although you didn't say it explicitly, I think it's sort of implicit, at least in your analysis, that you probably view it a bit similarly. And I think that's true, but it's true up to a point, right? That there's some scope for disagreement about how to define the national interest. And one of the things that's interesting is that cooperation takes place in time periods when national leaderships are able to perceive non-proliferation as being one of the end outcomes that will serve the national interest. Right? You could imagine in almost all of the cases you talk about that leaders could have had a different set of beliefs that were more inherently competitive and that discounted non-proliferation as an objective, and then none of this would have happened. So it's national interest, but it's national interest perceived in a way that ranks non-proliferation as one of the high-ranking objectives worth pursuing.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
Me too, actually.
I will too.
Question mark.
Yes. Well, no, I actually agree with that, and it's one of the things that has been, when I was listening to Nikolai's presentation, I was realizing that this is actually very relevant to mine as well, the idea that in this period of time, the United States and the Soviet Union wanted to kind of resolve the issues behind closed doors and then open it up and say, we did it, there is no problem here, everything is okay, and we work together to resolve this issue. And so I feel like when the international community when the expectation of you is that you're not going to compete about an issue that affects every single person living on the planet, that you're going to make it work, then there is a huge incentive to see where your national interests line up in that particular way. And I don't know what has happened now, but it doesn't, even though there is so much pressure from the non-nuclear weapon states to kind of make it work, for some reason that does not seem to be catalyzing cooperation in quite the same way that I see it having done in the cases that we're looking at.
Yeah, that was partly my motivation.
Yeah.
Is although your conclusions are sort of optimistic, they're optimistic assuming that you perceive the national interest a certain way, which doesn't seem to be, it's a little bit Nikolai's generational change here, right? It doesn't seem to be the prevailing conception in either country right now.
Well, I can point at two actually things. First of all, if you look at the key Russian documents that define on national security policy, like the National Security Council, Foreign Policy Council, military doctrine, you would see that during the previous decade, 2000 to 2010, non-proliferation always ranked somewhere in the top 3, maybe to top 5 interests. Well, alternatively, they would rank proliferation as one of the top 3 or something threats. But if you look at the 2015 document, you'd see it's actually number 19. It does not mean that Russia favors proliferation. No. So the interest is still there, but there are other threats that are seen as more immediate and really kind of take most of the time of the political leadership. So that's one example. The example on the US side is Iran, actually. Lieutenant Lon is completely right. So what would be the interest of the United States in stopping Iran from getting nuclear weapons? You negotiate with Iran to strike a deal to prevent proliferation, or you change the regime. To a large extent, 2 decades old, actually, U.S. policy on Iran show that as long as the United States is trying to change the regime, it doesn't actually work.
Let me make 2 observations, I think, relevant to your comments, Jeff. One, and this was, I think, hinted at in Nikolai's presentation, but I want to make it a little bit more explicit. One really, I think, has to look at the kind of the constellation of players and how they've changed in both the United States and Russia, the Soviet Union. That is, who were the parties making decisions relevant to different aspects of non-proliferation policy. And there were rather dramatic changes in both countries, or fluctuations, and that had a significant impact for the policies in both countries. And relevant to that point is, I think there may be a suggestion, which I think is mistaken, that somehow when the U.S. and the Soviet Union or the United States and Russia cooperate, that necessarily means that both are pursuing more stringent non-proliferation and export control policy. That's not always the case. And so you had a situation in the late 80s and early 90s when cooperation was still very significant, was pronounced. But in fact, particularly on the Russian side, stringent export controls were relaxed, in part because of the change in the institutional power of key actors, where you found those who were advocating exports for commercial gain tended to take priority over the traditional parties making Soviet non-proliferation policy, which were the Foreign Ministry and the Defense Ministry. So the players make a difference, and one shouldn't necessarily assume that cooperation means more stringent control. I mean, just as we see today, the one area in the arms control and disarmament sphere where the Russian Federation, rather, and the United States find the most common ground is opposition to the ban treaty, deliberation. So I think it's another interesting kind of point. Paul.
So my question is directed mostly to Sarah, but it's applicable to all. So when you were sifting through your declassified documents, do you come across, a high level of bureaucratic infighting within the U.S. administration? I mean, for instance, Brzezinski, often took a hardline stance on the Soviet Union, able to link progress to one issue with that of another. Would he kind of clash with Vance and ACTA that?
Maybe even Warnke.
Oh, yeah, I know they didn't get along.
Yeah.
But
It's a good question, and it's when I was kind of alluding to things that are missing from my story. I do think that that's a piece that is missing, because what we see when we look at the declassified documents that are available to us are things that are actually sent back and forth. What you don't ever get is someone's diary that was like, so-and-so was the worst at work today, and I just had a bad day. You don't really get too much of that. So I think that's not to say that that didn't exist. It's just that I think when we're looking at these materials, we have to be very careful that we know what the scope of the document is, so that you're not extrapolating from that there was no infighting. I will say, one thing that has been interesting, that the CIA has done it's digitized its CREST documents now, and you can look at those. And I have seen some cover, kind of like the equivalent of like a cover sheet that would go on a fax or something like that, where they will write, something in pencil that's like, this report's terrible, or, what were you thinking, things like that. So you do get a little bit more kind of personality coming through in that regard, I think, in those kinds of documents. And I have to figure out, I've been trying to work that into my narrative, but again, it only comes from the intelligence community, so I'm missing that piece then from like conversations that might have happened in the Department of State or between the Department of State and different embassies and things like that.
But I think you're absolutely right, and I think what you may want to do also, Sarah, you may find some of these episodes less apparent in the specific cases that you're looking at, but there are lots of other cases involving major non-proliferation issues where there have been various books written by principals, and there are other studies which highlight these institutional as well as bureaucratic political clashes.
Yeah.
So, there was this IMSI study, the International Fuel Cycle Evaluation, involved major disagreements as that was being formulated. So I think you probably can address this in a meaningful fashion. We can talk about that later.
Sometimes the NSC meeting minutes are also declassified, if you can find those.
Yeah, those are, things like that are helpful. And then also, for me, looking at the interaction between kind of parochial interests and then the people who are more focused on foreign policy was quite interesting. And you do see that. You'll see people saying, I think we're going to get a lot of questions from Congress about exactly where this special material went, and we should be thinking about this and stuff like that. So you can Find it.
Easy enough.
Is a two-finger on?
Oh, yes.
Okay, sure.
Oh, two finger on that. Yes, I actually did refer to some of these disagreements in my presentation, especially on Article 3. Yes, the Atomic Energy Commission, in fact, said with the Soviet Union, the State Department, with the Germans and the French, this was not, however, centered, and Bill is completely right. These disagreements that you see, sometimes don't, but they're not usually centered on a specific issue. Mostly they develop and are sustained throughout actually many years. On Article 3, for example, the agencies had the same position for about 5 to 7 years before they became apparent on Article 3. On declassified documents, you can usually see differences between the state and ACTA. Yes, and not as much. Sometimes you also see documents from the Pentagon, yes, and you can also kind of figure out some differences.
The other place where you should really look is in the negotiation of the NPT itself. And there have been studies there which show, I mean, in some instances, again, the Soviet Union and the United States saw kind of eye-to-eye more frequently than the different organs within the U.S. government. And I suspect that also was the case on the Soviet side, although I don't know that for a fact. Please.
You saw that recently in the article that the ambassador to the United Nations wrote about her Russian colleague who died, and she really a touching article in which she emphasized the importance of the relationship, and that kind of transcended any of the day-to-day disagreements. My interest in coming today is not as an academic. I'm not a
Can you
member of
identify
academia.
yourself for the group here?
Okay, thanks. Well, they say in the situation in which you find yourself determines what you do. So anyway, there's the situation. I'm coming today because I've been nervous about the statements of our leaders. One, the deployment of actually mobile nuclear elements in Europe by the Soviet Union, and the statement of our president that maybe limited use of tactical weapons is okay. That brings me back to the time when Nixon was saying we're just going to scare him a little bit by using a nuclear bomb. Well, that was a statement that he made that made me anxious enough to start a PSR chapter, Physicians for Social Responsibility chapter in San Antonio with 5 military bases, which is a challenge. But anyway, so I'm coming today out of a concern and possible thoughts of what might be done with Dr. Neutra and others to establish PSR, reactivate PSR. And an example of the cooperation that occurred during that period between physicians was interesting. The head of the Cardiology Institute in the Soviet Union and several physicians here, psychiatrists and cardiologists, were able to talk to their patients who were involved with the negotiations and maybe have their ear better than anyone else. So, you know, I'm coming for guidance, and I think that this is a crucial issue when things can happen very suddenly and people can be very impulsive. And I think we're living closer to midnight these days, and I'd like to get some ideas about how to turn back the clock.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we obviously share many of your concerns. I'm not sure I would agree with the characterization of all of the points that you made, but I think the fact that we have 2 Russian institutions engaged in a collaborative project with an American institution involving, among other parties, students from Russia, the United States, and other countries who are part of a dual degree, suggest that there is a recognition in both the United States and Russia about the need both to train the next generation and to recall the importance of cooperating in areas where there may be shared interests. And I think nuclear nonproliferation remains one of those. It's interesting, I'm just going to share maybe a historical anecdote with you. I would venture to say that up until 3 months ago, there were very few people in the United States who knew the name of Ambassador Sergei Kislyak. I might say, and someone that I've known probably as long as anybody in the United States, because Mr. Kislyak, who was trained as a nuclear engineer, was very focused on nonproliferation issues. In fact, contributed a chapter on the subject of Soviet nonproliferation policy to a book that I wrote in the 1980s. You fast forward about 10 years, and you find Mr. Kislyak as one of the two heads of the Russian delegation to the historic 1995 NPT review and extension conference. And so an individual today who is seen mainly because of the role that he played trying to interact, as one might expect a Russian ambassador to do, with senior political parties, had a very different kind of background in the past in an area where there was a long record of U.S.-Soviet cooperation. So some things have remained more or less constant, others have changed dramatically, and I think it's worthwhile, as Sarah particularly made an effort to highlight, to go back and to examine where we were able to cooperate in the past, why we were able to do so, and whether some of those conditions pertain today. Some may, some may not. Let me see, are there some other questions from those in the audience? Okay, we'll take 2 more questions, and others if I see them. Please, if you could identify yourself too. Yes.
Yes, I'm Craig Wonke. I'm just a community person. I read about this and decided I wanted to come and listen to your experience and wisdom. What most, very general question, what most gives you pause about either the leaders today in both countries or the circumstances or the leaders in other words, what makes you kind of go, ah?
Okay, who wants to answer that?
What doesn't make me the short
Every day.
Nikolai, you want to take a shot at that?
A very actually brief the gloomy response is domestic politics on both sides, and the fact that for domestic political reasons, everyone in both Washington and Moscow are actually very happy with the way the relationship is going. So yes, that's the whole point. I don't really see too many people, well, except maybe like idealistic people like us, but I don't really see too many people who would see an interest, a vested interest in trying to make things more positive. To do that, you need to invest some political capital, right? Yes, and no one really sees any reason to make that investment. Yes, and of course, more recently, the circus that you see inside the Beltway is particularly sad to see. Yes, I cannot see it as anything but a circus. Like, it has no relationship to real life, to real challenges. Yes, they are just playing politics out there.
I think the other thing, I'm not sure if you mentioned it this afternoon, but I know we've observed this in our own, research, and have commented, internally. If you go back and you read the cable traffic from the the 70s and the 80s.
They were smart people.
That you are really impressed. No, that's the point that I was going to make. You're really impressed with how wise and well educated these diplomats were, and I think you would be hard pressed today to find the same kind of particularly well informed and literate diplomats writing these kinds of memos. At least from like one reads in Wikipedia and
On Twitter.
or
Especially
Twitter. So that is sad, and I think in part our dual degree and also the program that we have beginning this summer, which will be a 7-week summer school for advanced graduate students interested in Russian issues, is an attempt to try to rebuild that expertise, particularly as it applies to the Russian sphere. Sarah, it's a two-finger,
Yeah.
and then we'll turn to...
I mean, this doesn't pertain specifically to the United States and Russia, but as someone who just, came out of this institution and is still here in a different capacity, one of the things that really worries me is there is such a threshold for vocabulary when you talk about non-proliferation issues, and if you haven't been steeped in it, there are words that seem like they mean something that do not actually mean that, or signal something completely different when you're talking with an ally, with an adversary.
What would one be?
Well, I mean, I'm just thinking about, when you say you want a nuclear arms race, if you don't actually understand what that means, or you don't understand the historic implications of it, or you don't understand the kind of intertextuality of that, I think you're indicating something inadvertently that you don't mean to say. And I feel very worried that to get back to your point, Dr. Potter, that there are individuals who are kind of responsible for putting out this message who don't have the kind of background and the capacity
To be blunt, she's talking about the president.
Thank you. Yes, but seriously, that is something that worries me quite a bit.
Well, it's not just the president, so right, that would be...
We have about 5 minutes, and so I'm going to collect 3 more questions, and then you'll all have a chance to respond after I saw you first.
Yeah, it's 3 quick notes to the 2 of you, to Sarah and to Adlan, and then just 1 point about research. To Sarah, I think it's a unique thing when there is intelligence sharing. And there is still a lot of questions about the South African case. There are all kind of semi-speculative things why they did it. Some people say they wanted to protect Dieter Gerhard and they wanted to use the Cosmos as a way to hide him. Some other reasons were they wanted to embarrass the United States about not having the knowledge in terms of intelligence. So the story is, I think, quite complex. From one person I think you should talk to is actually Brzezinski himself. Speak Brzezinski himself. He just talked to my good friend Kai Berg, very, very long interview, including about South Africa. And I think you should try to talk to him.
Can you help me?
I can help you.
Okay, great.
To you, Adlan, you gave a little bit what seems to me a little Pollyannish narrative of the U.S.-Soviet thing on Iran in the 90s. A lot of people believe, especially in retrospect, and some people say at the time, that the whole Al Gore and Einhorn kind of thing was in many ways cynical manipulation on the Russian side that ultimately hide and diverted us from the real activity. Boucher was never and was not then the focus to look at. There was a lot of time that was wasted on the Boucher thing, even this was not the main concern. So some people say it was a way to conceal and divert where the real actions, and actually the Russian plays some kind of very cynical role in that. One point of research in general, it's in 2 months going to be the anniversary of the 67th war. We still do not know what was the role. First, the American and Russian did not talk about Israel nuclear issue in the 60s, 66, 67. I got some very intriguing oral histories about the Soviet side, including some recently. There are some books, and going to be another book coming out in 2 months. A book by Isabella Guinor, and it's called Foxbot over Dimona. And they have a very complex theory. Some of it seems perhaps making sense out of it seems too far-fetched. But I think it would be terribly intriguing to investigate further the role of the Soviet Union on the questions of proliferation of nuclear weapons in the context of the 67 war.
Thanks.
And there was very little conversation between them and the US at the time.
Thanks. Let me two quick questions, then we'll wrap up. Sam?
Thank you very much, Sam Meyer, researcher here. Thank you, Nikolai and Sarah, for your presentations. I actually have a question. Also, thank you, Adeline, but I have a question specifically for you. As your case is kind of the most recent, it's sort of still being written, and I wonder how would you characterize the Russian reaction to the successful negotiation of the JCPOA? If you see that there's any building blocks there for further non-proliferation cooperation between the U.S. and Russia, if there's buyer's remorse because of it in some way, and if there's sort of a commitment to maintain the JCPOA.
Thanks, Sam. Please.
Hi, my name is Raymond Neutra. I'm a retired physician, epidemiologist, and scientific bureaucrat in California government. And like Dr. Donovan, we are wondering whether we could do something to get public attention to start changing that political environment that celebrates confrontation and tough guy activity with nuclear weapons. I'm just struck that we often talk about the Russians and what their interest is, and the Americans and what their interest is, and yet from my own bureaucratic experience, there are all kinds of players with ideologies and skills that, depending on the power plays around them, suddenly get a chance to act or not act. And it's sort of a room for social psychology, as in institutional psychology as it relates to all of these things.
Thank you. Okay, I'm glad we had a lot of interesting questions and enthusiasm for the subject matter. I'm going to try to give each of you a few minutes at most to respond to those questions that you would like to address. So, Adlan, you want to start?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, first to Dr. Cohen's question about cynical manipulation of Russians to cover the illicit activities with the Iranians. Well, I think that the level of coordination between the agencies was so poor that actually one hand didn't know what the other one was doing. For example, when the head of the Russian Ministry for Atomic Energy, Mikhailov, negotiated with Amrollahi, who was his counterpart in Iran at that time, the possibility of supplying Iran with enrichment equipment. Actually, the Ministry for Foreign Affairs didn't know about that. And the US delegation was the first one to submit this paper to President Yeltsin and say, hey, what's going on with you? Your minister negotiates something which you are not aware of. And that was a huge blow to Russian diplomacy because the Russians did not know what they were doing. So I fully understand why the US did not trust Russians enough, because when they don't know what they're doing there, how one can trust them? It was difficult, but we have to understand that the largest country in the world, which appeared in its new waters without any actual facilities to protect those borders and to have export control facilities and customs. For 10 years, it was so difficult for Russians to build such a system. And we even to build all the borderline and have this protection, even now it is difficult for Russia, at that time especially. And we had a lot of conflicts and a lot of other issues to be concerned about. And that's why and what was the gain? Iranians would never pay a lot, even if we start discussing this in a cynical way. The cost-benefit analysis, lab-to-lab cooperation with the Americans was much more beneficial for Russians. And even if some would love to take both, like cooperate with Iranians and with Americans, would be pretty futile, and they knew it. Only some people who didn't like think about it quite well before starting cooperation with Iranians.
The only
made
other
this
question I would
mistake.
ask you to address, we're going to run out of time in the room. Could you respond to
Yeah,
Sam's?
Russia is fully committed to JCPOA and is happy about it. And even though there were some people who would say, "Oh, Iranians would be embraced by the West after that, and Iran would start selling oil to the EU, and Russia would be somewhere else with no benefit from that," that is not true, because having a major crisis actually on its borders is not something that Russia would find attractive in a way.
Thanks. Sarah, do you want to respond to a question?
I'll just say, well, to Avner, I think that that's very interesting, and I did read some interesting declassified things that I'd be happy to send you, where there's a question about Israel's relationship with South Africa in the 1977 case. And you're right that I have not seen a lot of communication in the cables that talks about, we need to speak with our Russian counterparts about this issue. It's all internal US stuff. But so I agree with you that that would be interesting to look at almost as a counter narrative for when cooperation doesn't happen, why might that be the case? To your question, that's something that I've been thinking about recently myself, and in my research, I feel like domestic pressure is oftentimes what moves the policymaking agenda to talk about nuclear issues in a different way. And in this particular climate, I think that it feels to people like privilege to be worried about nuclear issues because it's not affecting their day-to-day. And so for many people in the voting population, that just isn't something that is at necessarily the top of their radar. And I also don't know how you kind of elevate the salience of that in our domestic discourse, but I do think that if it's possible to get people engaged with nuclear issues, maybe around testing or something of that nature, we know from this, the negotiation of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty that that's what pushed domestically for that treaty to be negotiated. We know that that has an impact on the way that policymakers make decisions, but how you get people to do that when they're worried about, paying their rent, I don't know. Maybe
Nikolai.
for that, Bill.
Yes, I'll just very briefly as to the same actual question, what can be done, and well, it's really hard to tell what can be done. I think that to a large extent the situation that we see now is simply the product of the fact that we no longer fear nuclear war like we used to during the Cold War. The threat's not imminent. So we can actually do a lot more things, sometimes reckless things. We don't have to value whatever cooperation we may have internationally, just because it's not that important. So yes, that's kind of the big change, I think. I myself actually thought when the Cold War was ending that we will very quickly get to eliminating nuclear weapons and things like that, because we don't have the nuclear war the Cold War anymore. Instead, in a way, actually, the situation became more dangerous, and also there is very little push kind of domestically to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. And one last point, the thing that I find troubling is that we do, well, that public kind of movements and everything tend to concentrate on nuclear weapons, forgetting that conventional weapons can be as deadly. You had the example of World War II, where the humankind lost 50 million people using the weapons that by today's standards are extremely primitive. So let's just not think that if we'll eliminate nuclear weapons, we'll save the humankind. No, we won't.
That's
So
supposed to be an
it's a broader
optimistic,
agenda. Well, it's actually to an extent that it's skepticism about the ban negotiations.
Yeah.
But
You would have profited had you been there last week.
maybe.
That's the subject for another seminar. But we could go on, and I suspect we will continue this conversation because the project continues. But I want to suggest that we all join in thanking our speakers for what I thought was a very interesting and provocative set of presentations.